This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today we're going to talk about the 2009 movie Dorian Gray, based on the book The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I'm your host, Steve, and today I'm joined by Annie, who is the writer of the blog 5'2". Thank you so much for being on today, Annie.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your biography and maybe some of your websites and where we can find you?
Well, my URL is 5'2blog.com, and I'm a university student, and I'm from Birmingham in England, and my degree's in English and writing, and I'm going to do my master's in film and writing, and I'm pretty much very obsessed with Oscar Wilde and William Shakespeare since I've had a life in sort of like drama and English, and it's all been incredibly sort of good for me at the moment. And The Picture of Dorian Gray is actually my favourite book, so yeah.
And in our conversations beforehand, you say that this is the type of book that you like to revisit.
Yeah, I make a habit of rereading this book at least once a month, every month. That I have done for the past probably about 10 years, which is a long time.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, we'll start off with a brief introduction of the movie. This movie, Dorian Gray, is based on the 1890 classic, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a story of a handsome youth who is able to somehow maintain his beautiful exterior for many years, but his spirit or core becomes completely the opposite, rotten and corrupted. The tagline of the movie is "Forever Young, Forever Cursed." Just briefly, the production details of the movie. This is all courtesy of Wikipedia and the Internet Movie Database. It was released in September of 2009, and it was filmed in various locations around London and England. It really has an incredibly rich and detailed background. It's directed by Oliver Parker with a runtime of about 112 minutes. And it only received a 43% Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic, which I thought was kind of surprising. And it had a box office of $22 million. Let's talk a little bit about the cast before we dig into the context of this movie, because it is, when you're talking about a book and a movie and a really detailed historical context that the movie and the book break out, it's this becomes a little bit more complicated and maybe a little bit more fun as well. Just overall, what were your impressions of the casting decisions of this movie?
I think Parker made overall okay decisions. I mean, Basil was incredibly well cast. Henry sort of well cast, but I think because of the 43% on the Rotten Tomatoes, most people were really confused about how Dorian Gray himself was cast, because of the sort of discrepancies between, the film and the book in terms of what he looked like and how he acted.
First, we have, as you said, Dorian Gray in the title role, played by Ben Barnes. He's a British actor, and he's probably best known for his role as Prince Caspian in the Chronicle of Narnia movies. And he was really panned by the critics for his portrayal of Dorian Gray, like you said. Did you think that he captured anything of Dorian Gray from the novel?
I mean, he has that sort of youthful look. He has that sort of innocent disposition, which sort of makes his personality great for the character. But if we do compare it to the book, he actually looks nothing like Dorian Gray at all. Because Dorian has sort of this tinted olive skin, whereas Barnes is quite pale. Whereas in the book, Dorian has blonde hair and blue eyes, whereas Barnes has quite dark features in that sense.
Yeah, it's almost like the exact opposite of the book version. Then we have Colin Firth as Lord Henry Wotton, and he's a well-known actor, Academy Award winner, BAFTAs, Golden Globes. I mean, you name it, he's probably won it. He's well-known for The King's Speech, but he has a dozen other movies that most people have ever seen. Well, just briefly, what did you think about him?
I mean, I think he really captured Henry's cynicism, but as you're saying with Oliver Parker used Colin Firth in the movie Centrinians that Parker directed as well, where Firth portrays quite a cynical, sarcastic man, but he didn't really look at the way in which Henry influenced Dorian. I mean, it was almost like it happened instantly, as in the book it kind of happens over a couple of chapters that Basil starts to realise that he's losing Dorian to Henry.
Then we have, and I'm really looking forward to talking about that character of Lord Henry, because I think he's one of the greatest characters of literature, especially in that first part of the novel. Then we have Ben Chaplin as Basil Hallward. It's going to be difficult to call him Basil. As an American, we say that Basil, but I think Basil sounds so much better. Ben Chaplin is a British actor of stage and screen, and he was recently in the 2015 version of Cinderella. You said that you liked his portrayal as Basil Hallward.
Yeah, I did. He was quite brilliant. I mean, after reading the book, and when I was anticipating the film when it came out, that is exactly how I pictured Basil to be, and it kind of brought him to life quite a lot to me. I really liked Ben Chaplin's portrayal of Basil.
Then to round out the main cast of the movie is Rachel Hurd Wood, and she plays Sybil Vane. She's also a British actress. Dorian Gray was probably up to this date probably her biggest role, but she also played Wendy Darling in the 2003 version of Peter Pan. Briefly, what did you think of her?
I thought she was overall a good choice for the character, but I think it's not really much of her fault, but her scripting was quite bad. I mean, a lot of her phrases, a lot of her sentences were very sort of like very dumbed down. I mean, in the book, she is quite, you can see the sort of obsession, almost like a sort of something psychologically wrong with her when it comes to Dorian. But like in the film, it's almost like she's just a little girl that's madly in love, like a Juliet archetype.
Let's just talk a little bit about what's the context of this movie and the book. If you could summarize that, what's the background we should expect coming into the movie and the book if we haven't read it before?
So the movie is on the book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is Oscar Wilde published it in Lippincott's magazine, July 1890. Okay, so he would have published it over the course of about 4 weeks, and it's about this sort of decadence that lies deep within the aristocracy of London, that really aesthetics and looks are valued greatly over sort of personality, and we can see this through sort of paradoxes that Lord Henry keeps saying about himself, about Dorian. I mean, one very famous one by Lord Henry, he says that deception is necessary in marriage, and it's this thing about having one face but actually being a completely different person. And this is supposed to reflect what Oscar Wilde says in the preface of the book. The 19th century's dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass, and it's that people who lived in London at this time did not want to sort of accept that they were in fact these hedonistic monsters, but would rather sort of look nice and be appreciated and have this sort of Faustian, almost incredibly indecent morality about them. And it's all based on the sort of aristocratic view of the Victorian public. We know that a lot of reviews of The Picture of Dorian Gray at this time were saying that it is a great novel, and one review said that one of the greatest, most terrible moral lessons that is this unworthy world has received at the hands of a great writer. So it's supposed to be a moral lesson. It's supposed to be Oscar Wilde sort of telling off the aristocracy, showing them their own face in a glass, and showing them what happens when they play with vices and virtues. So yeah.
Do you think that is an accurate portrayal of the aristocracy? I mean, every scene was going to the club and the theater, going to dinner. Like these people didn't do anything practical. Though Basil's the only one who actually did anything, or was Wilde trying to make a larger point with that portrayal?
I think the characters of Basil and Henry were supposed to be these sort of direct juxtapositions, because Basil is the one who does actual work, whereas Henry does not. And you see that Dorian's directly in between this. And when he is with Basil, he almost has this very innocent nature about him, and he's sort of very introverted. And it's only when he gets pulled away from this working, very practical man into a world where he doesn't have to be practical and can just sit around and appreciate what he has and his own appearance and his sort of hedonistic lifestyle, that everything goes out of control. And I think it's this pull from Basil to Henry that really starts Dorian's descent before, obviously, he dies at the end of the novel.
Let's dig right into the beginning of the movie, where it starts off with Basil Hallward, the artist, sketching Dorian Gray at the piano performance, and then he showcases various things about both of their personalities. Maybe set up that just initial scene, and how does it compare to the book?
Well, this actual piano scene never really happens in the book physically. It's mentioned, it's thrown around in discussion, but it doesn't actually happen. The reason why they put it in the movie is to showcase different characters and their archetypes and set this up for the reader. So Dorian is really very much the subject of everyone's attention, and that is made very clear from the beginning. Whereas Basil is the one that's sort of drawing him in the audience, the only one in the entire audience that is actually doing something, whereas everybody else is literally just sitting there staring at Dorian.
Very soon we're going to get into a theme that in the movie, it's very prominent in the movie, of Basil having a homosexual attraction to Dorian. Is that accurate portrayal in the movie, you think?
I think there's definitely an undertone in the book, but I don't think that there was very much of a requirement for so much concentration on it in the film, because there's definitely an appreciation for Dorian in the book. I mean, everybody has an appreciation for Dorian in the book, but in the film, I think they showcased it a bit too much, probably to sell the film or to make it slightly more controversial, but it definitely doesn't have that incredibly sort of concentrated tone in the book. No, so.
Later in the book, we're skipping ahead a little bit, but these things weren't really mentioned in the movie at all. They discuss some of the relationships that Dorian Gray has with other young aristocratic males in their circles. And they don't out and out say that they were homosexual relations, but I got an undertone of that maybe I'm reading into it with a modern viewpoint. Was there something more to that, or were they just trying to say that he really ingrained himself into these people's lives and corrupted them?
I think the relationship with other sort of males was supposed to hint at that homosexual undertone, and this is where people get, well, maybe he was having a relationship with Basil from, and it's that mention of Dorian being around other young men, and the fact that he was around Basil for so long that he must have had a homosexual relationship with him, and it's something that is not fully clear but is incredibly open to interpretation. I mean, it is a well-known fact that Dorian is this sort of Byronic hero. He almost has to have a complex sexuality because that's how we understand a Byronic hero. But I think that part of Dorian's sexuality is incredibly open, and it's only the way we interpret it. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer that Wilde really wanted us to understand.
Right, very interesting. Next in the movie, Basil this is where he's actually painting Dorian, and Dorian is, in the typical painting pose of the day. What was going on in that scene, and where does that lead us in the movie?
I mean, it in the movie, it's very much. I think it's done a little bit short almost, because this is the part where we see Dorian and Basil really bonding, but it happens completely differently in the book. I mean, it's dragged out for a while in the book. I mean, we see various parts of the painting, various parts of the paintbrush, and I think that Parker was really trying to home in on the fact that Basil is paying very close attention to Dorian, almost like creating these homosexual undertones. But it also gives a little bit of shade to the way it's carried out in the book, because in the book, it takes place, obviously Henry's already in the studio before Dorian even gets there at the beginning of the book. I mean, we don't actually meet Dorian until chapter 2, but in chapter 1, Basil and Henry are discussing Dorian, and I don't know whether this was right to translate it differently onto the film, but when you watch the 1945 film, it does seem a little bit jolted, the way that Dorian just comes into the scene. So I think Parker might have adapted it well, but it was a little bit cut short.
Then Lord Henry burns a rose while Dorian sells his soul to the painting. That happens really quickly in the movie. Explain how that compares to the book version of it, because it was the development was a little bit different between the two.
Yes, so the symbol of the rose burning means actually two different things to two different sets of people. And these sets of people are people who've read the book and people who have not. So Parker used this symbol incredibly cautiously, because he cannot assume that everybody has read this book. So as in the film, there were debates about whether the rose burning actually worked. It's supposed to represent this sort of consummation of a Faustian pact, the selling of Dorian's soul. But to the viewer who has not read the book, it could just be understood as some Victorian heathen practice they haven't heard of, or serve as some problematic understanding. It's supposed to be used to increase that amount of tension. So when we look at where the symbol comes from, the rose actually represents two things in the book. For the people who have actually read the book, the rose is sometimes the fire of Dorian's soul. So this is how it's been translated onto the screen when the rose is burning. And also, the roses that are mentioned in Dorian Gray aren't red. The rose that is being burned is red. The roses in the book are always white. He is the rose-white youth. So the use of the red rose could be to sort of gain some familiarity with the audience, because the use of a white rose would obviously be quite confusing. It's not as recognisable, as poignant as a red rose, but definitely the ones in the book are white, as to symbolise Dorian's innocence and purity.
Is that maybe trying to temper Dorian's moral agency in the movie to make him a little bit more relatable to us?
Yeah, definitely. I think the use of this red rose burning is it's incredibly it's a very gothic image. I mean, the red rose itself is iconic of the Gothic. We can read a lot of different Gothic novels which have the image of something that sticks out as poignantly red. including a rose, but maybe even to represent blood, or even with the burning of a red rose. It's a very iconic image when you burn a red rose, but I don't think it would have worked as well if you were to use the white rose, and it's purely based on relatability, yes.
Then it happens pretty quickly that Dorian starts to go downhill in the movie, sort of. Again, they it seems like in the movie they play with his agency to how quickly he goes into his moral descent. But this next part of the movie is Dorian and Basil attend one of the decadent parties, but then it gets into this whole theme about the actually displaying the painting. Can you maybe just tell us a little bit what was happening there and how it plays into? My question would be, like, how does this play into Dorian's ultimate downfall? And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
When they attend this party with showcasing the painting, we get sort of like I like to say a very Sherlock Holmes sort of archetype here, because the painting is displayed. There was a picture taken of Dorian with Basil and Henry, and that's later used in the movie against his downfall when Henry obviously figures out his secret. None of this ever happens in the book. Henry does not use the photographs against Dorian as to symbolise that he's using his own pictures against him. But I think that scene is particularly important to highlight, even when we see inside Dorian's house, that it is incredibly lavish, and he has sort of moved his grandfather's portrait to the side, rather, and it makes quite a good point as to symbolise that Dorian is actually the centre of everyone's attention, because in Victorian London, to go to somebody's house to view a painting is quite odd, unless they were somebody that was incredibly famous. And this only really showcases that the entirety of London would just turn up to look at Dorian.
In the movie, or actually in the book, Dorian's change happens a lot more subtly, you might say, and a lot slower and more methodically. What was Henry's role in the corruption of Dorian?
I mean, in the book, he's not really as, I wouldn't say as pushy as he is in the film. In the film, he's very much sort of like a Mephistopheles to Dorian's Faustus, but in the book, he's very much more of a suggestive agency. That he suggests things that constantly play on Dorian's mind. For example, the paradoxes of Henry, a lot of which were completely cut out from the film, which I feel sort of disjointed that methodical agency to Dorian's downfall. But Henry is definitely one of the main catalysts in how Dorian descends. Yeah.
I would say that Henry in the movie comes off more as a cad or a jerk, as opposed to in the book, where he's really a very three-dimensional character who he puts on this facade that's very, everything is, it's hard to even explain that everything that Henry does is to put forward this attitude. Do you feel that came across in the movie at all?
I think it came across when they did use his paradoxes, but I agree that Henry did come off as quite a bit of a sort of questionable character in the film, because he was very much like if you had an extremely strict father or something. But with in the book, he was this sort of multi-dimensional, was a very suggestive. He almost sounded like he had done this sort of thing before to somebody when he was in the book. Whereas in the film, it was almost like he was trying to make Dorian into something that everybody else wanted him to be. And that's why without those sort of paradoxes, without that suggestion, and with these constant sort of imperative statements, and also a lot of the script that Henry had in the film doesn't actually match up to the book. Some of it is incredibly cliche. He keeps going on about fire as well, which is incredibly strange in the movie. But I do think that Henry is a lot more forceful and probably less effective in the film than he is in the book.
I had another question. They didn't out and out say Harry's age. They got to the point that Dorian was very young, like probably just turning 18. Where was the Colin Firth character in relation to him, do you think, age-wise?
I mean, Henry in the film, well, Colin Firth's character must have been probably in his sort of late 30s or early 40s by this time, because at the end of the film, where it sort of flashes forward to a part that isn't even mentioned in the book, he is a lot older, and he's got a daughter that is probably the same age as Dorian.
Yeah, we'll get into that. That part's interesting. Let's leave it at that before we get into that. Now, this is the part, this moves in pretty parallel with the book and the movie, that Dorian meets a woman, Sybil Vane. That does happen in both. Yeah. What was similar and what was different between their relationship in the book and the movie?
Well, in the movie, Sybil and Dorian meet at the theatre. That is exactly what happens in the book. But what doesn't happen in the book is that their relationship gets off incredibly quickly. They meet at the theatre, and almost about after only one or two more meetings, they're already making love. But in the book, that never actually happens. In the book, it's very much stronger on Sybil's part. Her obsession with Dorian is almost psychotic. It's incredibly forceful. It's incredibly obsessive, and she calls him Prince Charming in the book, which I don't think she does in the film actually, but he doesn't actually make much of an effort to sort of requite this love to her, but rather just hangs around her for a bit in the book, whereas in the movie he seems almost incredibly swayed by her, as if he can be influenced by anything. And obviously her death in the book and her death in the film are quite poignant, but incredibly different, because obviously in the book she hangs herself and in the film she drowns.
Yeah, in the book, Dorian treats it, I think you can almost see Dorian as, he wasn't the bad guy in that situation. He was taking it as or at least this is how I took it, as the, kind of a classic aristocratic flirtation that was overly dramatic, but she took it maybe like 4 steps beyond that, which you can't blame him for what happened.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the film, it's much more a thing of that they both fall in love with each other, whereas in the book, you can definitely blame Dorian for her death, because he pretty much does not requite the love as much as she does, because there is one particular chapter in the book which is just dedicated to Sybil running around after her mother, explaining who Dorian is and how much she's obsessed with him, and this goes on for an entire chapter, whereas Dorian talks about her sporadically. It's done through letters. I mean, we only find about his engagement through other people, not actually through Dorian himself. And it's, I mean, in the book, it's a lot more psychotic on Sybil's part, whereas in the movie, it's almost like he is being swayed by her. He is requiting this love to her. And when she does kill herself, he's incredibly touched by this.
After that, that's where he goes pretty much downhill. Can you explain what happens in the movie as Dorian's character develops, and maybe how that compares and contrasts with how his character of this moral decline it compares and contrasts?
So when we have Sybil dying in the movie, we have her drowning, which is I don't know what Oliver Parker was trying to do there, but everybody really saw that as a bit of homage to Ophelia from Hamlet, who drowns after breaking up with the title character. But what happens in the movie after that is quite strange, because Dorian seems to almost go mad. He starts going on these hedonistic outbursts, travelling the world strangely, disappearing off somewhere for days, and a lot of this stuff, again, doesn't happen in the book. It's almost trying to make up for this sort of connection that Sybil and Dorian had, which wasn't supposed to happen, because Dorian isn't supposed to requite Sybil's love that much. I mean, and when they were trying to make this up, they had to have Dorian sort of throwing his money away, going on expensive trips, going to opium dens. I mean, the opium dens thing happens in the book, but these massive travels, these sort of strange disappearances, and obviously then we have the murder of Basil, which also happens in the book. But I think with Dorian's downfall, from the part that Sybil died in the film, it sort of skims over pretty quickly. It's like he doesn't even think about redemption until the very end. And I think it's almost slightly unbelievable. Whereas in the book, he's sort of constantly questioning himself. And this is where Lord Henry would jump back in and fill in with more suggestion.
In the movie, it goes pretty quickly to this scene or this party with Basil, where it's a pretty hedonistic affair. What happened in that scene in the movie?
Okay, so Dorian is is having a masquerade with these exotic dancers, really exemplifying this Victorian aristocratic obsession with Orientalism. He has this excess of alcohol, all of these very symbolistic things to demonstrate this hedonistic impulse of youth. And his main homosexual encounter is with Basil, to show these homosexual undertones. So we have Dorian in the midst of this euphoria, music in the background that is just right for the scene. I believe that if you actually look at the book in comparison to the film, that if this were to take place in the book, it would work, but because of the fact that Basil and Dorian are almost sort of too far apart by this time in the film, it doesn't quite work as well. But what actually physically happens is that Basil kisses Dorian and Dorian kisses Basil, and we get some sort of suggestion that they're probably going to have sex, but it's never shown to us. And this is supposed to be that homosexual undertone that hasn't been established. And I think what's happened is there are some things that Parker hasn't established from the book that are so important that he's kind of just trying to fit them in where he can. And I think that creates a little bit of disjointment there.
Did you feel that I got the impression that in the movie that Basil was a much weaker character than he was in in the book.
Yeah, I think that definitely he was a lot more played down in the movie. He has much more of a role in the book as it's like a tug of war between Basil and Henry for Dorian's morality, really. That Dorian pretty much is stuck in the middle until sort of latter parts of the book when he's just absolutely gone. And this is the point when Basil realises that he's lost. And Basil only loses because the painting is beginning to change. And in the movie, this happens a lot sooner than it does in the book. In the book, we see it happen over a gradual amount of time, whereas in the film, it almost takes place quite quickly, and then we have Basil's murder. But obviously, in the book, we have much more of a method to it, that it is Henry would suggest something, Dorian would go and do this something, and Basil would try and reel him back in. And that is more Basil's role in the book, whereas in the film he seems almost absent to this. And this is why we get Dorian's downfall happening so quickly, because there's nobody to reel him back in.
Yeah, in the movie, this happens. This scene's maybe, what, about a little over halfway into the movie, approximately?
Yeah, so it is quite far in to establish the homosexual undertones. If you wanted to do it, you would have done it much earlier. But I think only after watching the full movie do you pick up the undertones that were in sort of the painting scene at the beginning, or the rose burning scene, or the part where Basil is drawing Dorian from afar while Dorian plays the piano. But otherwise, you wouldn't really pick it up.
The scene where in the movie where Dorian kills Basil is much more violent, I got, than it was in the book. The book, it was almost an impulsive act, it seemed to me, where it was much more carnal, I guess you might say, in the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the book, it is much more impulsive. It's much more sort of I got to shut Basil up, or what have I done, that sort of thing. But it's much more don't take a second thought. Whereas in the movie, it almost seems a little bit planned. And obviously, with this sort of the way that it's filmed, it does happen differently to the way it does in the book, because in the film, Dorian slits Basil's throat, and in the book, I think Dorian stabs Basil in the back of the head, and it's that whole thing about whether Basil is actually looking at Dorian while Dorian is killing him, and it's this thing that Dorian is becoming what Henry wants him to become. But in the book, when we have this sort of very impulsive killing, it's Dorian acting sort of out of what he's already been taught, whereas in the book, he's acting out of sort of, he's almost at the pinnacle of his downfall in the movie. He's already there, he's already lost to Basil, whereas in the book, it's purely impulse, and this is one of those impulses that drives him to become lost. And I think that's what makes the time in the film quite distorted.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
In the movie, what happens after you say that this is the pinnacle of his decline? This is where they start to really diverge, the movie and the book. What happens after the killing of Basil?
Yeah, so when we get the killing of Basil as the pinnacle of Dorian's downfall, it's in the movie it is very much the part where we see that, yes, Dorian is a bad guy. He's no longer a good guy. He is much more of a villain than he was at the start. But obviously in the book, it's not very much like that. In the book, it's very much more suggestive. Henry has been constantly suggesting things to him in the book. And the film, we have him acting upon that suggestion for what is very much the first time that he actually really does anything for himself. So it's quite more poignant in the book than it is in the film.
In the movie, at this point, how would you compare the characters of Dorian Gray in the book and the movie at this point? Do you think that they were too one-dimensional about his character at this point in the movie?
I think yes, they didn't really work with what was happening around Dorian at this time. That obviously the painting was changing. He didn't really understand why. In the book at this time, he hasn't found out why the painting is changing and what's actually happening to him. But in the film, it's almost, if you examine like the way he acts, it's almost like he already knows. And I think this creates that sort of one-dimensional feel that Dorian is no longer this uncertain character. He's no longer this ambiguous Byronic hero, but now he's this very certain villain. And I think that really takes a lot out of the character in the film.
Yeah, I felt in the book that at each one of these steps where he has a moral decision to make, he always does have an internal debate about it. He never fully turns into a complete bad guy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the book, it's more like a battle between what Henry's taught him and what Dorian knows to be good and right. But in the film, because of how forceful Henry has been upon Dorian, we almost have no room for that moral debate anymore. It's almost like Henry has completely redesigned Dorian's character to suit this sort of very villainous, almost very impulsive role that doesn't give morality a second thought, which makes this character kind of unrelatable by this point.
One thing that happens in the movie that differs from the book is that in the movie, Lord Henry becomes more and more important, whereas in the book, what happens with Lord Henry?
Yeah, Lord Henry is quite an interesting character because of the part that he, halfway through the film, almost changes his mind. And it's very much confusing to somebody who has read and studied the book why Henry would change his mind all of a sudden. Because in the book, he doesn't. He just leaves him. He leaves Dorian there. And he doesn't leave him until like the last couple of chapters, and because it's still constant suggestion, and it's only when he feels that Dorian's character has literally broken that he can just leave Dorian there and not come back, because he almost knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, he's really hands off in the book, where in the movie things, like you said, Lord Henry, his character completely changes. He becomes a family man. What happens with that? That there's this gap in the movie, and then they come back many years later. Dorian looks the same, but things have changed in that social circle.
Yeah, I think what they really wanted to show is because the sort of performance of Henry was so incredibly forceful upon Dorian that they had to do something to reel that back in to sort of show how Dorian dies, because in the book it makes much more sense that it's very methodical up until the point that Dorian can't handle it anymore, and that's when Henry almost vanishes at the end of chapter 19 to leave Dorian to die, obviously. But in the film, it's very much that he's been so forceful that it makes no sense for him to disappear. And when Dorian does return looking exactly the same in some era that looks like the 1910s-ish, that doesn't make any sense. But when he does return, it's almost like Henry has to lose that forcefulness for Dorian to realise that it's wrong.
Yeah, they fast forward in the book and the movie. I would imagine that timeline's about the same, where it's maybe what would you say, maybe the course of about 30 years?
I Yeah, I would take it as about 30, 35 years, because it did seem quite strange to me, because when Dorian leaves at Basil's funeral, and this is when Henry says that his wife is with child. But when Dorian comes back, the kid is probably about the age that Dorian was when the painting was done, which would mean that it's probably only about 18 to 20 years. But then Henry looks like he's aged about 30, 35 years, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
No, and it's Basil, like you said in the movie, Basil has a funeral where he's taken care of, and a lot the circumstances of after he's died is a lot different in the book.
Yeah, in the book, it's more like everyone's frantically like looking around because he's disappeared. Nobody knows that Dorian's killed him, but like in the film, it's more like everyone sort of suspects it. Nobody wants to say it, because we get at Basil's funeral, we do get the sense that Henry kind of suspects Dorian of killing Basil, but then it confuses us, because when Henry suspects it all this time, he doesn't say anything, because it's almost like him mentioning that the kid is going to be born sort of takes some of the blame off Henry for sort of catalyzing this guy to kill one of his best friends. But also the fact that at the funeral, very interesting enough, Henry doesn't do a lot. Being the fact that he, after Dorian, was probably the closest person to Basil, he doesn't actually do very much at the funeral, which leads us to wonder why this scene is actually there at all.
In the movie, it seemed like they were trying to get at that Henry. Well, I mean, really, that is what they did in the movie, is that Henry went through this narrative arc that he starts off as like Dorian Gray, but then as he ages, he mellows out and becomes this family man. That never.
Yeah, and it's this has actually been debated about Basil's funeral in the film, that it represents one of two things. It can represent that Dorian becomes disorientated by the fact that he's killed Basil, which is one of his best friends, and almost detaches himself from that humanity which is in his home in London, and feels the urge to leave. It also connects with Henry, that feels that now that his best friend is dead, that he has to become more human. So it's bringing these two characters further apart.
In the book version, it seems a lot like oftentimes at these key moments that Dorian lucks out. Basil's supposed to be traveling, and he'll be gone for 6 months, and the people aren't very surprised if they haven't heard of him in 6 months, because he's in France for those 6 months, and Dorian knows that. There's also another scene that was in both the movie and the book with Sybil Vane's brother. How does James Vane? How does he fit into this story?
Oh, this is quite strange, because when James is looking for Dorian, and he catches him, he puts a knife up to him, and he says, "Oh, are you Dorian Gray?" And he does this in the book and the film, and it's nice. It's refreshing to see something that is actually quite similar, because when Dorian says that, "Look at me, I can't be that man because so much time has passed," and he leaves, he drops a cigarette case on the floor in the film, which doesn't happen in the book, with his name on it, that Henry has given to him. But in the book, James encounters a woman who is actually onlooking to all of this, which she says to James that Dorian sold his soul to the devil for a pretty face, and that tells James that yes, this is Dorian Gray, whereas in the movie it's sort of like just a little symbol of a cigarette case with Dorian's name on it, which I found a tad bit lazy.
Yeah, what really surprised me throughout the book and in the movie, and maybe you can explain a little bit why, well, at least what you think about this. I'm really interested in hearing. Nobody really seems that it's that odd that he hasn't aged.
Yeah, this is something that has sort of baffled everyone, especially when he returns from his travels, that it sort of lacks accuracy, a lot of accuracy to the book here, because in the book it's these supporting characters are trying to figure out, well, what the hell is actually going on? Why isn't this guy getting any older? And all of this gossip starts circulating. We really do get to explore Victorian intrigue through what's being talked about with Dorian in the book. Whereas I think in the film, what's happening is that Parker really wanted to establish some sort of dramatic irony almost, that we know what's happening to Dorian, but none of the other characters do, but that doesn't explain why they don't suspect it. I think also because when Dorian returns from his travels and nobody's really that much bothered that he looks exactly the same, that it could only mean that these people themselves have not evolved from just respecting looks, almost now like a hero worship of Dorian for remaining exactly the same. I think sometimes the film of the book takes the point of fantasy a little bit too seriously and kind of sort of disjoints itself from sort of regular psychology.
Let's talk about the picture for a moment and how it changes. Basically, my image of the picture from the book was similar to what it was in the movie. It was a picture of Dorian Gray, and it starts out as his youthful appearance, how he looks when he's young, and then obviously the trope of the movie is that the picture changes, and that's a big part of the book. How does the picture change throughout Dorian's life?
Well, in the film, it changes sort of. It starts off with, I think there's some sort of maggot, and then it starts to cry, and eventually Dorian's like he has to move it somewhere else. Whereas in the book, it seems to happen subtly. We get these strange sort of signs of Dorian becoming slightly older. Whereas in the film, I think they have to be more visual with it, as for people to understand why this painting is so important. That when Basil comes to view the painting in the book, this is the first time we get in the book any real strong imagery of what's happened to the painting, and this is far more poignant than when Basil sees the painting in the film, because of the fact we've seen these sort of odd, sort of almost less symbolic changes in the painting in the film. And I also think that Lord Henry has quite a lot to do more with the changes in the painting in the book than he does in the film. Lord Henry serves as the catalyst, and sort of these times that suggestions are made and Dorian does act, that these subtle changes happen, and that is almost a recurring sort of motif in the book. Whereas in the film, when Dorian goes off in his travels, for example, the painting changes an awful lot in a short amount of time.
Yeah, in the movie, I think the first change that he notices is after Sybil Vane, if I'm not mistaken, is found dead, where he notices something different in the eyes, and it takes several changes before he even really comprehends that the picture's changing.
Yeah, it happens, even though it happens less sort of less symbolically in the film, it does happen a lot faster that Dorian, it's ages before he realizes, but it almost seems like it happens less poignantly, whereas in the book we do actually get to see this methodical structure of Dorian's downfall being directly related to the painting, whereas in the film it's almost like, especially with the death of Sybil Vane and the painting cries, it's almost like the painting is sucking the humanity out of Dorian, whereas in the book it serves an actual purpose as being there to remind Dorian of exactly what he's doing.
Yeah, I pictured it in my mind in the book that it's turning into a picture of a mean old man, where in the movie film version it's the move well one thing is that the portrait is actually has like graphics to it. In the background changes and it's much more visual than the book portrays.
Yeah, because I feel that in the film that they were really trying to, again, I've said this, but Parker was really trying to hang on to the sense of gothic horror, and I think that really making the picture sort of have some sort of life to it, as if it's captured Dorian's soul, is probably the best way to go about retaining that gothic horror. But to people who've actually read the book, it just looks a little bit silly, to be honest.
In the film version, there's this introduction of this character that wasn't in the book, of Lord Henry's daughter. How do you think they were trying to fit that in with the book?
I think that obviously in chapter 19, Henry revisits the time in the book from chapter 19 where he first meets Dorian, and he says a very strange phrase. He says, "I don't think there have been such lilacs since the day I met you." And this is Henry's sort of one of Henry's great paradoxes, where he now has given up on Dorian. And I think in the film, I don't think people would have really picked up on the fact that there were lilacs in the very first scene, and now there's lilacs in the last scene, and they're not as bright as when Henry first met Dorian. So they had to use something else when Dorian came back from his travels, and to represent that Henry was now being reeled back in and was no longer going to be a part of Dorian's sort of hedonistic travels. They had to use something that was incredibly sensitive. So they used a daughter, but obviously the time that the daughter was born in comparison to how much time has actually happened is a little bit questionable.
What do you think that Lord Henry feels at the end of the book? What are we supposed to take away from what is Lord Henry? What does he think that his role is in what Dorian's become?
So when we look at Lord Henry's sort of final goodbyes to Dorian in chapter 19, he states that art has no influence upon action, which is the exact premise of the book. That Oscar Wilde does actually say the only reason for making art so beautiful is that it's completely useless, that it has no influence upon your actions. And this is Lord Henry saying that he does not believe that Dorian's secret is the one that is causing Dorian to act this way. And this is what the film misses, because it's Lord Henry that eventually, now that he's destroyed Dorian, he's really just trying to say, well, this is what I actually think. And in the book, it's a lot more sort of, you're a lot more taken aback by it and the way that he's speaking at the end of chapter 19 than you are in the film. Because in the film, he has this sort of almost not very believable presence to him being incredibly forceful, to him now being a family man, being quite dumbed down, being quite tame. whereas obviously in the book we've got this sort of foreshadowing that is obviously kind of a little bit like the rose burning. Lord Henry he's not trying to moralise Dorian, but he is trying to give us the main message of the book, which he doesn't give us in the film.
What happens in the end of the book, and how does that compare to what happens at the end of the movie?
Well, in the end of the book, Henry sort of denounces Dorian. We move on to chapter 20, where Dorian is very much alone, disillusioned, sort of in his own state, very much questioning himself, a lot like he's done for a lot of the book. So it doesn't seem very unusual to us. But in the book, it's much more poignant because of the actions he takes against this. He goes over all the events of the book and what he's done, which compared to the movie isn't actually very much, but it's much more, it's almost much more chilling what happens in the book compared to what happens in the film. So Dorian is slowly but sort of cynically trying to denounce his own existence, and at the end of the book he finally takes it upon himself to take his own life by stabbing the painting. Whereas in the film, it's very oddly done because he almost impulsively realizes what he's doing wrong, and he has this sort of like a Victorian Mexican standoff with Henry in the painting's room, where Henry's gotten the key and he's gone to the room of the painting, and he's having a look at what happened, and then, oh God, he finds Basil's scarf, which is covered in blood. And it all seems very much very put together, whereas in the book it's more existential, it's more internalized, it's more emotional. You really feel for Dorian in the book, and when he eventually does stab the painting in the book, it's very much more symbolic. As it is in the film, he has to first set the room on fire, and then Henry kind of locks him in there. His daughter is screaming, and then Dorian eventually stabs the painting. But then we get another scene at the end of the film where we get this sort of strange zoom onto the painting, which suggests that Dorian's soul is actually kind of trapped in there, which we don't get in the book at all.
No, I thought that final scene in the book where it's he's alone and it's all about Dorian, where in the film it's like an action sequence that was, even I don't think that it fit in the movie very well, that it was so action packed, and there's fire and all, there's, I think there was even a little bit of fighting. It seemed very disjointed for the movie, where that the last scene in the book was so powerful.
Yeah, this is it. I mean, in the book, it's supposed to be about Dorian's own morality, and I think purely it's because the Picture of Dorian Gray as a book is so much more internalized towards Dorian's thoughts that I think Parker would have thought that it wouldn't translate well on screen because it's more psychological as opposed to sort of action. It wouldn't appeal to a mass audience as opposed to just the people who've read the book.
Also, that last scene in the book where he kills himself and the servants wake up and then there's the scream and the people outside hear it, and they're aristocrats who know Dorian and they're kind of snarky about it, and then the servants have to break into the room. They don't really care about Dorian at all. They're really concerned about how's this going to affect their lives. It all kind of, to me at least, it felt like nobody really cared about Dorian. That it was almost like this last thing that you felt sorry for him at the end.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Wilde wanted. I mean, he wanted this particular paragraph to be Dorian alone, very existential. And when the servants do break in, I mean, it even says in the last sentence that they didn't know what was going on, and only when they saw the rings on the guy's hand did they recognize who it was. And it's all about that, only respecting what's on the outside. I mean, the image of the rings is quite important. That it's quite aristocratic to own rings, obviously, but also because nobody actually cared about Dorian unless he was physically there. Unless he was physically existing in their presence, he would not be anyone's centre of attention unless he was being gossiped about snarkily behind his back.
And that wraps up the movie and the book. What's your conclusion of the film? What do you take away from it?
So when I watched the film, I actually watched it a couple of weeks after it hit the cinema, but on the whole, I thought it was a good attempt at a gothic horror, but it did take a lot out of context for me, being somebody who did love the book, and I still do. But when I went to look at the reviews quite recently, that they were all quite mixed. It went from being quite interesting and psychological to mostly being disastrous, a mistake, a misfire, leaving nothing up to the imagination and destroying the very essence of the film. And I do agree with this, that it lost that essence of ambiguity. I mean, there is this sort of unwritten rule in writing that it's better to show than tell. And I think in the movie that it told so much that in that sort of last part that doesn't even happen in the book, with Henry's daughter and that, it had to quickly go over itself and tie everything up. And Philip French in The Observer actually states that depravity is better suggested than made explicit. And this sums up the majority of the bad views, that French deals with the text being this ambiguous, this intensely existential, philosophical novel. I mean, The Picture of Dorian Gray is itself classed as philosophical fiction. It's not classed as a gothic horror. People have made it into a gothic horror, and I think that the fact that it's classed as philosophical fiction would make it quite difficult to film. Even Empire magazine had stated that it was an ambitious yet decidedly uneven interpretation of the last great gothic horror novel. Now, it is an ambitious production. I mean, it did want to get into the heart of what Victorian London was like, but I think because there was so much concentration on performing this for an audience who probably haven't read the book, that I feel that Parker was put in a position where he had to use other methods that probably would almost detach from the people who had read the book. They would see the film and feel almost jaded by the whole experience.
Yeah, I have to say that it didn't come off well as a major motion picture, that this would probably be much better as a Netflix series or something like that. Then it has to make a lot of compromises to be a big motion picture that it does in maybe other mediums.
And I mean, like it is a common problem when people try and adapt, especially 19th century fiction. We saw it the same with Frankenstein, which constantly misses out things from the book in every single adaptation. So when people are surprised that Dorian Gray did the same thing, I don't really understand why they're quite surprised by that, because pretty much every single Gothic novel has something philosophical at its main foundation that is completely missed out because of the fact it's too blown up in the book.
Overall, what would you say if you were telling someone, if somebody came to you and asked, should I watch this movie? What would you say?
I would definitely recommend them to watch it if they hadn't read the book. If they didn't read the book, I would say watch it and don't read the book, because then they'd be able to appreciate it as a film. I feel that especially after you've read the book, especially with The Picture of Dorian Gray, a lot of people love the book. And after you read the book, it makes it incredibly difficult to enjoy the film, which I actually tried very hard to do. And it makes it almost impossible, because you're sitting there and you're thinking about when certain things are going to appear. Like, when is Henry going to tell Dorian that he's out of it? When is James Vane going to appear and the lady's going to say, oh, he sold his soul to the devil for a pretty face, which never happens. And you're waiting for these things to take place that never take place because they're too abstract and they will not translate well onto film.
Yeah, I think that that's probably my takeaway of the whole film, is that it's blunt. It loses all the subtlety of the book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the book is told in subtlety, especially Dorian's sexuality. Then we have Dorian's downfall. Everything is very much methodical in the book, a lot more so than it is in the film. And I feel that in the film, it's trying to lose that sort of very abstracty, very sort of philosophical, very educated way of telling a story, and it's trying to make it into a blockbuster. And I think what's happened here is that has resulted into just bad writing with the script. It's packed with cliches.
Well, I want to thank you so much. This has been a very entertaining discussion, and I feel like I've learned so much more about the book and the movie. I would definitely suggest getting the book and watching the movie, but follow your order of it. If you want to enjoy it as a movie, don't go in having the book in your background first.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say definitely watch the film before you read the book, because that way you can at least enjoy the film once.
And I see that you've also done a lot of writing on books like The Prestige. That's actually one of my favorite books as well.
Yeah, same here. I absolutely love that book. It's brilliant. I was actually reading it again quite recently, about last week.
Well, thanks a lot for coming on. And we can find you on the internet. I would definitely highly suggest going to your blog. There's a lot of good entries, and you also have a YouTube channel.
Yeah, I do have a YouTube channel, which has been a little bit sporadic in the last couple of weeks since I've been doing my undergrad dissertation.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Annie of the 5'2" blog today as well. Links to learn more about Annie and her blog can be found at 5'2blog.com or in the show notes. If you'd like to learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, see show notes, and connect to social media, go over to a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear from you. We can talk movies, and I would definitely like to hear your ideas for future shows. Please share ideas for movies to cover, guests, or show topics. The email address is steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you like what you hear, I would really appreciate you leaving the show a rating and review on iTunes. Rating and reviews really help a great deal to let me know what you think about the show and how to make the show better. We'll see you next time beyond the big screen.